The woman in the business suit was used to traveling, but this time something felt off as she settled into her seat. The plane had a strange hum today, as if it was waiting for something to happen. She placed her small medical bag under the seat in front of her, with a deliberate motion, not a single wrinkle on her face, to reveal the uncertainty in her mind, as the cabin filled with the soft chatter of other passengers. The flight attendant appeared with a bright smile, too bright, too eager. She was young, probably in her 20s. Her name tag read Sarah. But the woman didn't bother to glance at it. Sarah moved down the aisle with practiced ease, offering drinks and snacks to the passengers. When she reached the woman, she hesitated for a moment before speaking, as if uncertain of what to say. Her smile faded just a bit before it returned. "Can I get you something to drink?" Sarah asked in a tone that was a little too sweet, a little too careful. The woman gave a soft smile and shook her head. "No, thanks," she replied, her eyes drifting briefly to the medical bag under her seat. Sarah's gaze followed hers. The pause was long enough for the woman to feel it, but she didn't look up from the window. Instead, Sarah continued her rounds without another word. The brief interaction didn't sit right with her. The woman shifted in her seat, a sense of unease creeping up her spine. It wasn't the first time she'd encountered a skeptical look from someone, but there was something in the air today, a different kind of tension, a kind of unease that hadn't been there before. The hum of the engines and the distant chatter of the passengers faded into the background as Sarah moved back down the aisle. The woman noticed how she kept looking back at her, like something was off. The flight attendant's gaze lingered just a moment too long before Sarah turned back to her duties. It was subtle but unmistakable. The woman wondered if Sarah knew something she didn't. As the hours stretched on the cabin remained quiet, the woman lost herself in the gentle sway of the plane, her thoughts drifting between the pages of her medical journal. It was almost peaceful, but every few minutes Sarah would pass by, and that same skeptical look would flicker in her eyes. The woman felt it more with each glance, but she chose to ignore it. The woman had dealt with doubts before she'd learned to tune them out, but today it seemed harder than usual, the silence between them growing thicker as time passed. Sarah's soft footsteps echoed in the aisle as she made her way back toward the front of the plane. The woman's fingers tightened around her journal, then relaxed. She glanced at the clock on the wall. Just as the plane hit a slight bump in the air, nothing major, just enough to make everyone's seatbelt light flicker. The woman looked out the window once again and saw the setting sun sinking lower into the horizon. The orange glow cast shadows over her seat, and for the briefest moment she felt a chill despite the warmth of the cabin. She told herself it was nothing, the kind of feeling that came when you've been in the air too long and your mind starts playing tricks. But something told her this flight was different this time. Something was waiting just beyond the horizon, and it wasn't the sunset. The plane hummed steadily through the sky as the woman's thoughts remained sharp, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the edge of her medical bag as she felt the weight of the silence growing stronger. The flight attendant, Sarah, returned to her seat, glancing at the woman once more. This time it wasn't just a casual glance. There was something more to it, a flicker of doubt, or perhaps curiosity, that the woman couldn't ignore. Sarah's footsteps were light but purposeful as she made her way down the aisle, offering drinks to passengers who barely noticed her presence. When she reached the woman's seat again, she stopped for just a moment, too long, a slight pause, before she spoke. "Are you sure you don't want anything?" Sarah asked this time. Her tone wasn't as cheerful, it was edged with something else, almost as if she were trying to probe deeper into the woman's story. The woman looked up from her journal, meeting Sarah's gaze for a brief moment. Before answering, "No, thank you," she said again, her voice calm. But this time there was an edge to it, as though she were warning Sarah to back off. Sarah's eyes flickered to the medical bag once more, and the silence between them stretched thinner. The woman could feel Sarah's doubt now thick in the air. It was clear she didn't believe her, not fully. Sarah couldn't have known what the woman had been through, or why she was carrying that bag. But the way she kept staring told a different story. The flight attendant's smile was too wide, and her hands too quick as she moved back down the aisle. The woman couldn't help but watch her go. The unease was building now. She could feel it tugging at the back of her mind, like something was about to happen, something she couldn't quite name, but felt deep in her bones. The flight continued as planned, and Sarah continued her rounds, though the woman could see she was watching her more now. The glances were quick but frequent, and the tension was palpable. It was as if Sarah were waiting for something to happen, but what the woman wasn't sure yet. But then it came. Without warning, a loud bang echoed from the back of the plane, so sudden that everyone jumped in their seats. The lights flickered briefly, and then went out only for a moment, but enough to make passengers murmur in concern. A few gasps broke the silence as the seatbelt sign flickered to life. Once more hushed panic settled over the cabin. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, but it was hard to make out the words. Something was happening, and the unease that had been creeping in now surged forward. The woman stood before the seatbelt sign, had even fully illuminated her hand, reached for her medical bag instinctively. She didn't wait to hear more. She couldn't. She knew something was wrong. She knew that voice on the intercom wasn't reassuring. The woman stood and started down the aisle, her gaze locked on Sarah, who had paused in the middle of the aisle, her face pale, her hands slightly trembling. She was frozen. Sarah's eyes met hers, and in that moment the woman knew without a doubt the flight attendant wasn't ready for what was coming. She wasn't ready for the crisis that had just started unfolding on this very flight. The woman's heart raced as she moved toward the back of the plane. The air around her felt thicker, now charged with an unease that hadn't been there moments ago. The sounds of murmurs and whispers filled the cabin, but none of it reached her as she made her way past rows of bewildered passengers. The loud bang had shaken everyone, but the woman had already sensed something wasn't right before it even happened. She could feel the shift, the change in the atmosphere. Sarah had frozen in place back at her post, still standing rigid in the aisle, her eyes following the woman's every move, no longer with skepticism, but with something more like fear. The woman's hand tightened around the handle of her medical bag, her knuckles white. As she stepped toward the back, she was already mentally preparing herself for what she might find. The faint buzz of the intercom crackled again, but no one could hear what the captain was saying. The words were drowned out by the rising panic. The woman's steps were swift and purposeful, her training kicking in. But even so, she could feel the tension mounting with every step closer to the rear of the plane. The voices grew louder, passengers asking what was going on, and the steady hum of the plane felt oddly muted now, like a distant memory. As she reached the final row, near the rear, she could see the commotion. A man was slumped in his seat, his face flushed, his body stiff and unmoving. A small crowd of passengers had gathered around him, but no one seemed to know what to do. Panic was spreading like wildfire, but no one had the nerve to take charge. No one. But the woman, as she approached the group of passengers, parted for her instinctively. They could feel it too, the presence of someone who knew what to do. They moved aside, and she knelt beside the man, her eyes quickly scanning the scene. She could hear the frantic whispers of the passengers around her, but she drowned them out, her focus narrowing to the man's condition. His breathing was shallow and labored, his pulse weak, his chest barely rising and falling with each breath. The woman's training had already kicked in. She didn't need to ask for help. She could already see everything she needed to know in front of her. The flight attendants were nowhere near ready to handle this, and Sarah's frozen stance at the front of the cabin confirmed it. The woman quickly began working. She opened her medical bag and pulled out the necessary tools. She was moving fast, but with precision, her hands steady. As she checked the man's vitals, the panic around her was palpable, yet it seemed to fade into the background as she focused entirely on saving this life. Her mind was a whirlwind of calculations as she worked silently, but with urgency. Every movement deliberate, every decision instinctive. This wasn't the time for hesitation, but that's exactly what Sarah was doing from the front of the plane. The woman could see her watching from a distance, her eyes wide, filled with a mixture of disbelief and horror. She was waiting for something, but what the woman couldn't afford to dwell on it. She couldn't afford to look up. She had a life to save. And that was all that mattered right now. The tension in the cabin was growing thick. As the woman continued to work, the man's condition was worsening. But she didn't flinch. Her heart pounded in her chest. But her hands remained steady as she performed the necessary steps to stabilize him. It was the only thing that mattered now. The woman's hands moved swiftly and decisively as she worked to stabilize the man. His breath was shallow, but she could feel a faint pulse beneath her fingers. His heart was still fighting, but it was slowing. She could hear the murmurs around her, the passengers no longer whispering, but speaking in hushed tones, as if afraid to disturb the gravity of the moment. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut through. As the woman continued her work, every second mattered. She had to act fast, or the man wouldn't make it. The flight attendants were still standing in the aisle, frozen, as if unsure what to do. Sarah was one of them, standing there at the edge of the aisle, her eyes wide with disbelief. As she watched the woman take charge, her expression changing from confusion to fear. The woman could feel Sarah's eyes on her, but she refused to let it distract her. The sound of the man's labored breathing filled her ears, drowning out everything else. The quiet hum of the plane now seemed distant, as if the world had narrowed to this moment, this single fight for survival. The woman's fingers pressed against the man's chest, her mind running through the steps in her training, her eyes never leaving his face. As she administered the necessary treatment, she had no time to question. She didn't even allow herself to hesitate. She was moving on instinct, her every movement deliberate but swift. When the man's body jerked slightly, her breath caught in her throat. Was it the beginning of a recovery, or the final signs of something worse? The woman's heart pounded in her chest. As she applied pressure, once more she had to keep him alive. No matter what it took, she could feel his pulse strengthen, but it was still weak, not enough to give her hope yet. But it was something. The quiet murmurs of the passengers grew louder as the woman worked desperately to keep the man stable. But there was no mistaking the fear in the air. Now it was thick and palpable. Even the most experienced passengers knew this wasn't an ordinary emergency. This was something far worse, and the woman was alone in her efforts. No one else had the courage or the knowledge to step forward to help. Sarah had finally moved, but only to fetch a small oxygen mask from the emergency kit. Her hands trembled as she passed it to the woman, but the hesitation was clear. It wasn't fear for the man, it was fear of the woman, fear of what she might do or what might happen next. The woman's focus didn't waver. She could feel the weight of Sarah's hesitation, but she couldn't afford to dwell on it. The man's condition was deteriorating faster than she could manage, and she needed more than just her knowledge. Now she needed to push herself beyond anything she had done before. The cabin was silent, except for the sound of the woman's steady voice, now instructing the passengers around her to clear space, to allow her room to work. It was strange how the chaos around her seemed to fade away as she became consumed by the task ahead. The man's condition was slipping through her fingers like water. No matter how hard she tried to hold on, the uncertainty was eating away at her. No matter how hard she fought against it, time was running out, and she was starting to wonder if she was too late. The woman's fingers moved faster, now each action more urgent, as the man's breathing became more erratic, his chest rising and falling in a struggle to stay alive. She could feel the panic slowly creeping up on her, but she pushed it down. There was no room for panic now, only focus. Her hands moved expertly over the man's chest as she worked to clear his airways, her eyes scanning his face for any sign of improvement. But there was nothing, just the same labored breathing and the desperate rhythm of her own heart pounding in her ears around her. The cabin was still eerily silent, but the tension was suffocating. Every breath felt like it took a lifetime. The passengers sat frozen in their seats, their eyes wide with fear. But no one moved to help. Sarah had returned to her spot near the front of the cabin, watching from a distance, her hands clenched at her sides, her face pale. The woman could see her reflection in the windows as she worked, and something about Sarah's expression chilled her more than the cool air in the cabin. There was a flicker of recognition in Sarah's eyes now on knowing something she hadn't seen before. But the woman didn't have time to consider it. The man's pulse was weakening again, and she could feel the life slipping from his body. She couldn't let him go, not like this. Not here, not now. She pressed down harder this time, her hands more forceful, but steady. She could feel the sweat on her brow as she continued her struggle to keep him alive. Each second felt like an eternity. She could hear the whispers of the passengers growing louder now. But it didn't matter, nothing mattered. But this man's life. She could feel the room closing in, the walls felt like they were getting tighter, the oxygen in the cabin thicker with each passing moment. The woman's breath came in short, shallow gasps. But she forced herself to stay calm, forced herself to remain in control. She had done this before. She had faced moments like this before. But this was different. This was something she couldn't quite explain, something about the air, something about the way Sarah had reacted. She couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right here. And it wasn't just the emergency or the man's condition. It was everything. It was the way the cabin felt so still, so frozen in time, the way the passengers weren't moving, even the way Sarah had looked at her with those wide eyes full of something that wasn't just fear, it was doubt. She could feel the sweat trickling down the back of her neck, but she ignored it, her hands moving faster, more forcefully. Now the seconds ticking by like an endless countdown. The man's condition was deteriorating faster than she could manage, the weight of the moment pressing down on her chest. She couldn't lose him, not like this, not when she was so close. She could see the flicker of life returning to his face, his color beginning to return. But it wasn't enough, not yet. She pressed down harder one last time, her heart racing, her eyes locked on the man's face, waiting for any sign that he was coming back from the edge. But there was nothing except the suffocating silence around her, and the pounding of her own heartbeat in her ears. She wasn't sure how much longer she could hold on. The woman's breath was shaky, now her hands slick with sweat, as she pressed down once more on the man's chest. She could feel the faint thrum of his heart under her fingertips, but it was weak, far too weak, and she knew time was slipping away faster than she could handle. The pulse in her own throat matched the erratic beat of the man's heart. And yet she couldn't stop. She refused to stop, not until she had done everything she could. Her eyes darted over the faces of the passengers, still watching in stunned silence, their eyes wide, their mouths frozen in fear. No one was moving. And it struck her then that she was alone, not just in this moment, but in this entire situation. No one was helping, no one was offering advice or support, not even Sarah. The flight attendant, who had seemed so eager earlier, was standing off to the side, her face pale, her arms trembling slightly. The woman couldn't afford to let it distract her. But the way Sarah was looking at her now told her everything she needed to know. Sarah wasn't just frightened. She was uncertain about whether the woman could actually save this man, or worse, uncertain about what might happen if she didn't. The woman glanced up for just a moment, catching Sarah's gaze, but she saw no reassurance, no confidence in the flight attendant's eyes, only doubt and fear. It shook her more than it should have, but she quickly pushed it aside. She couldn't let herself be affected by it, not now, no. When everything was on the line, the woman pressed harder, her focus narrowing as she checked the man's pulse again. This time it was stronger, just a little, but it was there, the faintest thrum of life, still holding on, and for a brief moment she allowed herself to hope. But then the plane hit a bump, and the cabin jerked violently. Her hands flew off the man's chest for a split second. As the woman's body was thrown forward, she caught herself quickly, but not before she had a sharp gasp from the back of the plane. The passengers screamed in panic, their voices echoing through the cabin as the plane dipped again and then leveled out. The woman's heart lurched in her chest, but she didn't hesitate. She was back at the man's side. In an instant she could see the fear in the passengers' eyes as they looked toward her for answers. But she had none. All she had was the knowledge she carried in her hands, and the hope that it would be enough. The intercom crackled again. The captain's voice came through, sounding distant and muffled, but the message was clear. Remain seated. We are experiencing turbulence. Please fasten your seat belts. The woman ignored the announcement. As the plane lurched again, this time more violently than before, she could hear the panicked cries from the front of the plane, the sound of flight attendants rushing through the aisles. But it was too late to be distracted by it. She had one job now, and it was to save this man. But every passing moment felt like an eternity. His breath was slowing once more, and she could feel the panic clawing at her chest, threatening to break through. But she fought it back, focusing only on the life in her hands. Nothing else mattered, except that she could pull him back from the edge. Just one more push, and then maybe, just maybe, he would make it. But as the seconds ticked by and the turbulence continued to rock the plane, she wasn't sure if she could hold on much longer. The woman's hands were trembling now, but her focus was sharper than ever. Her fingers moved swiftly over the man's chest, but his breath was growing even weaker with each passing second. The turbulence had become a constant, and the plane was bucking under the strain, as if it were alive, as if it were trying to fight against them. The cabin around her was alive with panic. The shrill cries of passengers, the hurried footsteps of the flight attendants as they ran to the front. But the woman didn't look up. She couldn't. Her mind was too full of the man beneath her hands, his pulse so faint now. She was fighting against something she couldn't control. She pressed down again, harder this time, forcing air into his lungs. But there was no sign of improvement. His chest, barely rising beneath her touch, the weight of failure began to press against her chest like a stone. But she wouldn't let it crush her. She couldn't let it. She couldn't give up, not when she was so close. She checked his pulse again, and for a moment it felt like time stood still. There was a faint flutter under her fingers, just a spark of life, and in that brief moment she allowed herself to believe he might make it. But then the plane lurched again, the sound of screaming passengers filling the cabin as the plane dropped suddenly. It wasn't just a bump this time, it was a full jolt, and the woman was thrown forward this time. Her head cracked against the edge of the seat in front of her, her vision blurred for a second. But she didn't let the pain register. Her body moved on instinct as she scrambled to steady herself and get back to the man. She could feel the fear creeping in, but she refused to let it show. She had to keep going. The turbulence was relentless, and the cries of the passengers grew louder. The chaos was all around her, but she didn't let it distract her. Not now, not when it mattered the most. She knelt back down and began working again, her hands moving mechanically through the motions, each one a desperate prayer for life. Her eyes flicked to the side, catching a glimpse of Sarah, who had come closer now. But she was still standing back, her face still full of doubt, her hands trembling like she wasn't sure what to do. But the woman didn't care about Sarah anymore. Her focus was entirely on the man, who was still breathing, but only just. She could see his lips turning pale and his eyes fluttering closed. He was slipping away. She could feel it, but she refused to let go of hope. She pressed down once more, her voice a low command to the passengers around her. Stay back, give me space. She barked even as she continued her efforts, her hands moving faster with each second. She could feel the air around her growing heavier as the pressure in the cabin increased, as the plane continued to lurch through the air. She didn't know how much longer she could keep this up. Her body was aching, her mind was fading with exhaustion, but she had to stay awake. She had to stay focused on the man in front of her. The moment she looked away, even for an instant, he might be gone, and she couldn't let that happen. Not today, not now. She was going to save him or die, trying every fiber of her being screamed to hold on, to hope, even as it seemed to slip further and further from her grasp. But she couldn't give up, not now, not when he was so close. The woman's arms burned with exhaustion, but she didn't stop. Her hands were moving on autopilot, now each compression harder than the last. But the man's pulse was still faint, barely there. The moments felt like hours, the turbulence relentless, the plane shaking violently with every jolt, every movement, amplifying the growing sense of desperation around her. She could feel the weight of the eyes of the passengers on her, their silent prayers hanging heavy in the air. But she couldn't think about them. She couldn't think about anything except the man lying before her, his life slipping away with every passing second. She had already given everything she had, her body aching from the strain, her breath ragged. But still she pressed on. The sound of the captain's voice, crackling over the intercom, brought no comfort. It was a faint echo over the chaos, the announcement muffled by the static and the panic in the air. "Please remain seated," the voice repeated, but it felt like an empty command in the face of the crisis. Unfolding, the woman barely registered it as her eyes flicked to the man's face. His lips were blue now, and his eyelids fluttered with shallow, irregular breaths. His body was cold, but his heart was still beating faintly. But it wasn't enough. She had to do more. She had to keep going. There was no other choice. Her heart pounded in her chest with each compression. As she pressed down once more harder, this time desperation creeping into her movements, she could hear her own voice now, a whispered command to the man. Come on, don't you dare leave me." The words were barely audible, but they were there, wrapped in a thread of hope, a flicker of belief that maybe, just maybe, he would make it. But then there was something in his chest, a small rise, a shift, and then it happened, a sudden and full breath. The man gasped sharply, his chest lifting in a long, deep inhale. His color slowly started returning to his face, his pulse stronger than before. The woman's breath caught in her throat, and for a moment she couldn't move. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. The plane lurched again, but this time it barely registered. The chaos of the cabin was still raging around them, but the woman didn't hear it anymore. All she could hear was the steady beat of the man's heart, growing stronger with each passing second. She pulled back slightly, her hands shaking from the intensity of the moment. She could see his eyes flutter open just a crack, and then they focused on her for a moment. Everything stopped. He blinked once, then twice, as if he were still trying to understand what had happened to him. The woman's chest rose and fell in heavy breaths. She had done it. He was alive. Her heart was still racing, but it wasn't from fear anymore. It was from relief, from the overwhelming sense of victory. She had saved him. The passengers were still watching in stunned silence, but now the air felt different, lighter. Somehow the weight of the panic had lifted, and a calm was beginning to spread through the cabin. She glanced over at Sarah, the flight attendant, who was standing frozen, her hands still shaking. But there was something new in her eyes, a deep respect that hadn't been there before. The woman looked back down at the man, who was now breathing steadily, his eyes still on her, and then with a final sigh of relief, she allowed herself to relax just a little. For the first time since this had all started, she had saved him against all odds. And as the plane continued on its journey, the chaos around them faded into the background. The woman had faced the storm and emerged victorious.